The mall was my second home. I worked at a cozy bookstore on the second floor, surrounded by the comforting smell of paper and ink. Every evening felt the same. Families shopped, kids ran past the storefront, and the faint sound of pop music played over the speakers. It was a peaceful routine, one I had grown to love. That night, I was organizing a new shipment of books when I noticed something odd. A child's laughter echoed faintly, but it seemed to come from inside the store, not outside. I glanced around and saw nothing unusual, just customers browsing quietly. Shrugging it off, I returned to my task. The mall's closing announcements began playing over the intercom, signaling it was time to wrap up for the day. My coworker Sarah offered to handle the register while I finished shelving books in the back. Everything felt normal, until it didn't. As I placed the last book on the shelf, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The usual hum of activity outside had faded into an eerie silence. Even the music playing over the speakers seemed distant, distorted somehow. I shook off the unease and told myself it was just another slow evening at work. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The lights flickered once, then twice, casting strange shadows across the store. It wasn't uncommon for this old mall to have electrical issues, but this time felt different. The air grew colder, and I swear I heard faint whispers coming from somewhere near the storage room at the back of the store. "Sarah!" I called out instinctively, though I knew she was still at the register up front. There was no response, just that persistent whispering sound that seemed to grow louder as I stood there frozen in place. I walked toward the storage room door cautiously, feeling a strange heaviness in my chest with each step. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle and pushed it open slowly. Inside, there was nothing but rows of boxes and shelves stacked high with inventory. Still, that whispering sound persisted, growing louder as if it were coming from all around me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Sarah, *be right back. Confused, I turned to look toward the register again, but she wasn't there anymore. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Sarah never left without saying something. She'd always been responsible like that. Her jacket still hung on the chair behind the counter, and her bag sat untouched under the desk. Panic began to creep in as I tried calling her phone. It rang once, twice, and then stopped abruptly mid-ring. The sound came not from her bag but from inside the storage room where I had just been moments ago. My heart raced as I stepped back into that cold, dark space with my phone's flashlight guiding me this time. On the floor lay her phone. Its screen cracked as though it had been dropped in a hurry, but there was no sign of Sarah anywhere. "This isn't funny," I muttered aloud, hoping she'd jump out laughing and call it a prank. Instead, silence answered me, a silence so thick it felt alive somehow, pressing against my ears like an invisible weight. I locked up early that night and went straight to mall security to report Sarah missing. The guard on duty seemed uninterested at first until I mentioned hearing whispers and finding her phone in an empty room. His face paled slightly before he quickly masked his reaction with indifference. "We'll check the cameras," he said curtly and escorted me to their surveillance room down a dimly lit corridor behind their office area. Together we reviewed footage of our store from earlier that evening on one of their grainy monitors mounted high above us. On wall brackets covered dust cobwebs alike, neglected relics past decades gone by unnoticed, forgotten time itself seemingly frozen place here amidst flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead casting sickly yellow glow, everything beneath them making even mundane objects appear sinister, somehow unnatural, light bathed. Shadows danced walls, floor alike mocking reality itself. Distorted forms, shapes, fleeting glimpses, movement, corners, vision gone before could focus properly long enough to discern anything concrete, tangible truth hidden plain sight, elusive specter haunting every frame, replayed screen before us revealing chilling truth beyond comprehension, rational thought, logical reasoning alike, boundaries shattered irrevocably forevermore. The footage was chilling. Sarah walked into the storage room at 8:47 p.m., her phone in hand. She paused at the doorway as if she heard something, then stepped inside. The camera glitched for a few seconds, showing only static. When the image returned, Sarah was gone. No one else entered or exited the room during that time. I stared at the screen, my mind racing for an explanation. What happened to her? I asked the guard, my voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the screen with a furrowed brow. "Sometimes, strange things happen in this mall," he muttered under his breath before quickly dismissing me with a promise to investigate further. The next day, I returned to work feeling uneasy. Customers came and went as usual, but their behavior seemed off. Several mentioned feeling chills or seeing shadows move out of the corner of their eyes while browsing the shelves. One woman left abruptly after claiming she heard someone whisper her name near the back of the store when no one else was around. My manager dismissed their complaints as paranoia or overactive imaginations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That evening, I stayed late to close up again, alone this time, since Sarah was still missing and no one wanted to cover her shift. As I locked the front doors, I caught sight of someone standing just outside on the other side of the glass. A tall figure cloaked entirely in shadow despite being directly under one of the bright overhead lights outside. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, staring at it. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I blinked, and it was gone, vanished into thin air as if it had never been there at all. My heart pounded as I quickly finished locking up and hurried out through the employee exit at the back of the store. The parking lot felt eerily empty as I made my way to my car, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. When I finally got inside and locked the doors, I let out a shaky breath. But as I started the engine and looked in my rearview mirror, I saw it again, standing in the shadows at the edge of the lot, watching me drive away. The next morning, I went back to mall security to see if they had found anything new about Sarah's disappearance, or about the figure I had seen outside the store. The guard from before greeted me with a grim expression and motioned for me to follow him into the surveillance room again. "You're not going to believe this," he said as he pulled up footage from last night. The cameras outside my store showed me locking up and walking away, but no sign of the shadowy figure I had seen standing just beyond the glass doors. It was as if it had been invisible to everyone but me. "Are you sure you saw someone?" he asked skeptically, but his tone betrayed a hint of fear beneath his professional demeanor. "I know what I saw," I insisted, though doubt began to creep into my mind. Determined to find answers, I started researching the mall's history during my breaks at work. What I discovered sent shivers down my spine. Decades ago, before it became a shopping center, this land had been home to an orphanage that burned down under mysterious circumstances. Dozens of children and staff members perished in the fire, and their bodies were never recovered. Rumors swirled about restless spirits haunting the area ever since, but they were just urban legends, right? One night after closing, I decided to explore an abandoned wing of the mall that hadn't been used in years, a section rumored to be where most of the paranormal activity occurred. Dust-covered mannequins stood eerily still in forgotten storefronts, their glassy eyes reflecting my flashlight beam as I walked past them. I stared at the photo, my hands trembling as I held it closer to the beam of my flashlight. It was old, the edges yellowed and curling, but there was no mistaking it. Sarah was standing among the children in the photograph. She looked exactly the same as she did now. Same short black hair, same warm smile. But how could that be possible? The caption beneath the photo read *Orphanage Picnic, Summer 1982. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Sarah wasn't even born in 1982, or at least, that's what I had always assumed. I flipped through more clippings pinned to the board. They detailed the fire that had destroyed the orphanage, claiming over 50 lives. Witnesses reported hearing screams long after the flames had engulfed the building, and some claimed to see shadowy figures lingering in the ruins for weeks afterward. One article mentioned something chilling. Several bodies were never recovered, and strange occurrences have plagued this site ever since. My heart pounded as I pieced it together. Could Sarah somehow be connected to this tragedy? And if so, what had happened to her? The whispers started again, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me in an invisible circle of sound. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the room, but there was no one there, just rows of dusty shelves and forgotten mannequins staring blankly into space. Then I saw it, a shadow moving against the far wall, darker than anything else in the room and completely detached from any light source. It wasn't just a shadow, it was alive. The shadow stretched unnaturally across the wall like liquid darkness, its edges rippling as if it were breathing. My flashlight flickered violently as I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Who's there?" I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't need to. It moved toward me slowly, its form shifting and twisting into something vaguely human but utterly wrong. I stumbled backward into one of the mannequins, knocking it over with a loud crash. The sound seemed to anger the shadow. It surged forward suddenly, faster than I thought possible. Cold air enveloped me as it passed through my body like smoke, leaving me gasping for breath and clutching at my chest. For a moment, everything went black. My vision, my thoughts, even my sense of self felt swallowed by that darkness. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the abandoned store. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered in the air like an oppressive weight pressing down on my shoulders. My flashlight lay several feet away, its beam flickering weakly against one of the mannequin's faces. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed it before bolting out of the store without looking back. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I pored over every article and photo I had taken from that bulletin board, trying to find any clue that could explain what was happening. One name kept appearing in connection with the fire: Eleanor Marsh, a caretaker at the orphanage who reportedly vanished during the blaze along with several children under her care. Witnesses claimed she had been seen leading them into a basement moments before the building collapsed, but no basement had ever been found during subsequent investigations. Something about Eleanor's story felt familiar. Too familiar. I remembered Sarah mentioning once how she'd grown up in foster care but rarely talked about her past beyond that. Could Eleanor have been connected to her somehow? And if so, was Sarah even who she claimed to be? The next evening after work, I returned to that abandoned wing of the mall armed with a crowbar and a growing sense of dread. If there really was a basement beneath this place, a hidden part of its dark history, I needed to find it. The whispers started again as soon as I stepped inside one of the empty stores, louder this time and more insistent than before. They seemed to guide me toward a section of cracked tiles near the back wall where faint scratches marked an outline on the floor. I pried at them with all my strength until one finally gave way, revealing a narrow staircase descending into pitch-black darkness below. The air grew colder with every step I took down those creaking stairs, carrying with it a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. At the bottom lay a network of tunnels carved roughly into stone, clearly not part of any official mall construction plans. In one tunnel lay remnants of burned furniture, and bones scattered among ashes. Sarah's voice echoed faintly behind me. I always hated working the late shift at the clothing store. The mall was eerily quiet after 9 p.m., with most shops already closed and only the occasional janitor or security guard wandering the halls. But tonight felt different. The store was unusually busy for a Thursday evening, with last-minute shoppers darting between racks of clothes and mannequins dressed in the latest trends. I worked in the fitting room area, folding discarded garments and returning them to their proper places. It was tedious but mindless work, and I didn't mind it, until I noticed something strange. One of the mannequins near the entrance seemed to be facing a different direction than it had earlier in the day. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone had bumped into it or a coworker had moved it while setting up a display. But as I kept glancing over, I could swear it was facing me directly now, its blank, featureless face tilted slightly as if observing me. By the time the last customer left, it was nearly 10 p.m. My coworker Lisa had already clocked out, leaving me alone to finish closing duties. As I locked the fitting room doors and began tidying up the racks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The mannequin near the entrance still stood in its usual spot, but something about its posture seemed off. Its head was angled slightly downward now, as if looking at its own hands that were no longer resting at its sides but raised slightly, almost like they were reaching out for something. I laughed nervously to myself, brushing off the unease as exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. "You're losing it," I muttered under my breath as I turned away to finish my work. But then I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from behind me. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around, but the mannequin hadn't moved, or had it? Its arms were definitely higher now, bent at unnatural angles that made my skin crawl. I decided to ignore it and focus on finishing up so I could leave as quickly as possible. After all, mannequins didn't move on their own. It was ridiculous to even think such a thing. But as I walked toward the back room to grab my bag, I heard another sound. A soft thud followed by what sounded like footsteps echoing faintly across the tiled floor. My stomach twisted with fear as I turned back toward the sales floor. The mannequin was gone. I froze in place, My breath caught in my throat as my eyes scanned the store for any sign of it. It couldn't have just disappeared. Someone must have moved it. Right? But there was no one else here. I had locked the doors myself after the last customer left. Panic began to set in as I realized that not only was the mannequin missing, but so were several others scattered throughout the store. The lights flickered overhead as I stepped cautiously back onto the sales floor, clutching my phone tightly in one hand with my flashlight app open. Rows of clothing racks stretched out before me like a labyrinth of fabric and shadows, each aisle darker and more foreboding than the last. The mannequins were nowhere to be seen, not near the entrance where they'd been earlier or anywhere else on display. Then I saw them, clustered together at the far end of the store near one of the fitting rooms, their rigid forms arranged in a semicircle like they were waiting for something, or someone. My flashlight beam wavered as my hands shook uncontrollably. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, backing away slowly toward the exit. When I reached for the door handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside somehow, even though I hadn't touched it since closing up earlier. My phone buzzed suddenly in my hand with an incoming text message from an unknown number. "Stay with us." My blood ran cold as I stared at those 3 words on my screen before looking back toward where the mannequins had been moments ago, only to find them gone again. A sharp crash shattered the silence behind me as one of the glass display cases near checkout exploded outward without warning. Shards rained down onto floor glittering under flickering fluorescent lights above, casting eerie glow over scene chaos unfolding around me. Mannequins, once lifeless, now animated, moving jerky unnatural motions, advancing closer, step nearer, cornered nowhere, run, hide, heart-pounding ears, deafening roar, terror consuming every fiber being. I ran blindly through the aisles, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and the mannequins. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, and deliberate, as if they were learning how to walk for the first time. The sound of their stiff limbs scraping against the tiled floor echoed behind me, growing louder with every step. I ducked into a narrow aisle between 2 racks of clothing, hoping to lose them in the maze of fabric and shadows. My breath came in ragged gasps as I crouched low, peeking out from between the hangers. At first, there was only silence. Then I saw one of them, a mannequin with a cracked face and missing fingers, lurching past the end of the aisle. Its head turned slowly, scanning the area like it was searching for something. For me. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me hiding just a few feet away. But then another mannequin appeared, and another, until they were all standing at the end of the aisle, their blank faces tilted toward me in unison. I bolted before they could react, knocking over racks of clothes in my desperate attempt to escape. The mannequins followed, their movements faster now, more fluid as if they were adapting to the chase. I stumbled into the storage room at the back of the store and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the lock, twisting it into place just as something heavy crashed against the other side. The mannequins were relentless, pounding on the door with an unnatural strength that made it rattle on its hinges. I backed away slowly, scanning the room for anything I could use to defend myself. The storage room was cluttered with boxes and supplies, but nothing that seemed remotely useful against whatever these things were. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, and I hesitated before pulling it out to check the message. "You can't hide forever." My stomach churned as I stared at those words on the screen. How were they sending me messages? Were they even real? The pounding on the door stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the noise. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the mannequins was already inside. It stood motionless in the corner of the room, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. Its blank face was turned toward me, its featureless gaze boring into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. How had it gotten in without me noticing? Had it been there all along? I took a cautious step backward, keeping my eyes locked on it as I searched for an escape route. But before I could move any farther, its head tilted sharply to one side with a sickening crack. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, and I froze in place as its arms began to move, slowly at first, then faster as it stepped out from behind the boxes and started toward me. In my panic, I tripped over a loose floorboard and fell hard onto my hands and knees. That's when I saw it, a small trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of old inventory boxes near the back wall. Desperation overtook fear as I scrambled toward it, yanking away the boxes and prying open the door with trembling hands. A narrow ladder descended into darkness below, and without hesitation, I climbed down into whatever lay beneath. The air grew colder as I descended into what appeared to be an old maintenance tunnel beneath the store. The walls were lined with rusted pipes that dripped water onto the damp concrete floor below. My flashlight flickered weakly in the darkness, casting long shadows that danced eerily along the walls. As I ventured deeper into the tunnel system, I began to notice strange markings etched into the walls, symbols and words written in a language I didn't recognize but that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. At last, I stumbled upon a small chamber at the end of one tunnel where dozens of dismembered mannequin parts lay scattered across the floor like discarded toys. In the center of the chamber stood an altar covered in melted wax and dried blood, evidence of some kind of ritual that had taken place here long ago. The mannequins weren't just props. They were vessels for something ancient and malevolent that had been awakened by whatever dark forces lingered beneath this mall. Working at the electronics store in the mall was uneventful most days. I spent my shifts helping customers choose phones, laptops, and accessories, all while counting down the hours until I could leave. The mall was a sprawling labyrinth of stores, food courts, and escalators. But my favorite part was the old service elevator tucked away in a quiet corner near the loading docks. It wasn't used much anymore. Most employees preferred the newer freight elevators, but I liked it. It had a certain charm with its creaky doors and faded buttons. That evening, after my shift ended, I decided to take the old elevator down to the parking garage. The mall was nearly empty by then, with only a few stragglers wandering the halls and janitors cleaning up for the night. As I approached the elevator, I noticed something strange. The doors were already open, as if waiting for me. Normally, they stayed shut unless someone called it. I hesitated for a moment but shrugged it off as a coincidence and stepped inside. The elevator smelled faintly of oil and mildew, its dim light flickering overhead as I pressed the button for the parking level. The doors groaned shut with a metallic clang, and the elevator jolted slightly before descending. At first, everything seemed normal, just another ride in an old machine. But as I leaned back against the wall, I noticed something odd. The floor indicator above the doors wasn't moving. It stayed stuck on 2, even though I could feel the elevator descending deeper and deeper into the building. I frowned and pressed the button again, thinking maybe it hadn't registered properly. But nothing happened. The elevator just kept going down. The hum of machinery grew louder, almost deafening, as if we were plunging into some vast chasm below the mall. My stomach twisted uneasily as I realized we had been moving for far too long. The parking garage was only 3 levels down. By now, we should have stopped. Minutes passed, or at least it felt like minutes. It was hard to tell in that suffocating box of flickering light and grinding metal. The air grew colder with each passing second, and my breath fogged up in front of me despite it being midsummer outside. Panic began to set in as I hammered on the buttons for every floor above me, but none of them responded. The elevator didn't even slow down. It just kept descending into what felt like an endless void beneath the mall. Suddenly, there was a loud clang from above me, followed by a series of sharp metallic creaks that made my heart leap into my throat. It sounded like something, or someone, was crawling on top of the elevator car. I froze in place, straining to hear over the deafening hum of machinery around me. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then came a faint scraping sound from above, a rhythmic scratching like nails dragging across metal. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it maintenance workers? An animal? Or something else entirely? I pressed myself against the wall of the elevator, clutching my phone tightly in one hand as I turned on its flashlight app and aimed it at the ceiling panel. The light wavered as my hands shook uncontrollably. "Hello," I called out weakly, my voice barely audible over the noise around me. Without warning, the elevator jolted to a sudden stop that nearly knocked me off my feet. The lights flickered violently before plunging me into total darkness for several agonizing seconds. When they came back on again, the doors creaked open slowly to reveal nothing. Beyond the threshold lay an empty corridor shrouded in shadows, definitely not part of any parking garage or mall level I had ever seen before. I stepped out cautiously, my shoes echoing against the cold concrete floor. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights mounted high above. The walls were covered in strange graffiti, symbols and patterns I didn't recognize. They spiraled inward and outward, like some hypnotic maze designed to disorient anyone who dared to look too closely. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang, like rust or blood. I ran my fingers along the wall, hoping to find some clue as to where I was, but the surface was rough and uneven, almost like stone instead of concrete. The further I walked, the more unsettling the graffiti became. At first, it was just abstract shapes and lines, but soon I began to notice crude drawings of faces, twisted, screaming faces with hollow eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved. My flashlight flickered weakly in the oppressive darkness, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like living things. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from somewhere deep within the corridor. It wasn't the mechanical hum of the elevator or the creaking of old pipes, it was something else entirely. A low, guttural noise that sent chills racing down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to turn back and run, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the elevator doors were gone. The hallway behind me now stretched into darkness just like the one ahead. The noise grew louder as I pressed forward, my heart pounding in my chest with every step. It wasn't just one sound anymore, it was many. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from every direction at once. The whispers were incoherent at first, just a jumble of voices overlapping each other, but as I strained to listen, I began to make out words. Asterisk, keep going. Asterisk, asterisk, don't stop. Asterisk, asterisk, they're coming. Asterisk. I quickened my pace, desperate to escape whatever was behind me. But then I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows ahead. At first, they were barely visible, just faint outlines against the dim light. But as they drew closer, their forms became clearer, tall and gaunt with elongated limbs and faces that seemed wrong. Their features were distorted, as if someone had tried to sculpt them out of clay but gave up halfway through. They didn't walk, they glided silently across the floor toward me, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. Panic surged through me as I turned and bolted in the opposite direction, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. No matter how far or fast I ran, the hallway never seemed to end. The graffiti on the walls repeated itself in an endless cycle, and even though I knew I was moving forward, it felt like I was going in circles. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop, not with those things following me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them still gliding after me, their movements unnaturally smooth and deliberate. They weren't running, they didn't need to. Somehow, they always seemed to be just a few steps behind no matter how far ahead I thought I'd gotten. Then it hit me, this wasn't a normal hallway, it was a trap. A maze designed to keep me running until I collapsed from exhaustion or madness. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a door appeared on my left, a heavy metal door with no handle or markings except for a single word scratched into its surface. Asterisk, exit. Asterisk. Without thinking twice, I threw myself against it with all my strength. To my surprise, it swung open easily despite its weight. Beyond the door lay another corridor, but this one was different. It was narrower and darker than before, with walls made of smooth black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The room was suffocatingly small, its walls, floor, and ceiling entirely covered in mirrors. As I stepped inside, my reflection multiplied infinitely, creating a dizzying maze of identical versions of myself staring back at me. My flashlight's weak beam bounced off the glass, casting fragmented light that made it harder to focus. I took a cautious step forward, and the sound of my footstep echoed unnaturally, as though the room itself was amplifying the noise. At first, everything seemed normal, just an unsettling room of mirrors. But as I moved deeper inside, I noticed something was wrong. The reflections weren't quite right. They lagged behind my movements by a fraction of a second, their gestures slightly delayed as if they were studying me before mimicking my actions. My heart raced as I waved my hand experimentally. The reflections followed, but their faces began to distort, smiles stretching too wide, eyes growing hollow and dark. I backed away toward the door, but it had vanished. The smooth mirrored surface now stretched seamlessly behind me, trapping me inside this endless reflection. Panic set in as I pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then one of the reflections tilted its head at an unnatural angle and stepped forward, out of sync with the others. The reflection that had stepped forward wasn't me anymore. Its face twisted into something grotesque, a mockery of humanity with jagged teeth and empty black eyes that stared straight into my soul. It pressed its hands against the glass on its side of the mirror, and to my horror, the surface rippled like water under its touch. I stumbled backward as more reflections broke free from their mirrored prisons, stepping into the room with jerky, unnatural movements. Their distorted faces grinned maniacally as they surrounded me, their hollow eyes glinting with malice. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, clutching my head as their whispers filled the air around me. Asterisk, you don't belong here. Asterisk, asterisk, stay with us. Asterisk, asterisk, we've been waiting. Asterisk. One of them lunged at me suddenly, its claw-like hands reaching for my throat. I ducked just in time and bolted toward what I thought was an exit, but every wall looked identical in this maze of mirrors. My own distorted reflection stared back at me from every angle, mocking my desperation. As I ran blindly through the mirrored labyrinth, a voice boomed through the room, deep and resonant, filled with malice yet strangely familiar. It called my name over and over again, louder each time until it became unbearable. "Why did you come here?" it demanded, echoing endlessly in my mind. I collapsed to my knees, covering my ears in a futile attempt to block out the sound. The reflections closed in around me, their grotesque faces leering down as they whispered in unison, "Asterisk, you can't leave." Asterisk, the voice grew quieter then, almost soothing as it spoke again. "There's only one way out." I looked up and saw something new, a single mirror at the center of the room that shimmered differently from the others. Its surface was dark and swirling like liquid glass, and within it was an image of myself, but not as I was now. This version of me looked calm and composed, almost peaceful. The voice spoke again, "Step through and leave your fear behind, or stay here forever." My heart pounded as I stared at the swirling mirror. Was this a trap? Or was it truly a way out? The reflections around me began to close in tighter, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. Asterisk, don't trust it. Asterisk, asterisk, it's lying. Asterisk, asterisk, stay with us. Asterisk. I hesitated for what felt like an eternity before making my decision. With trembling hands, I reached out toward the dark mirror. Its surface rippled under my touch like water before pulling me inside with a sudden force that knocked the breath out of me. I woke up gasping for air on the cold floor of the parking garage beneath the mall. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as if nothing had happened, but everything felt wrong. The air smelled different, even the colors around me seemed muted somehow. As I stood up shakily and looked around, I realized something horrifying. There were no cars in sight, not mine or anyone else's. I made my way toward what should have been the elevator lobby, but found only a blank concrete wall where the doors should have been. Panic surged through me again as I realized that while I had escaped the mirror room, I hadn't truly left whatever nightmare this was. Weeks have passed since that night, but nothing feels real anymore. Shadows move where they shouldn't, whispers follow me wherever I go, and sometimes when I look in mirrors too long, I see them staring back at me, the distorted reflections from that cursed room. I know now that I didn't escape alone. Something came back with me. It's always there in the corner of my vision or lurking just beyond my reach in every reflective surface I pass by. And every night when I close my eyes to sleep, I hear that voice calling my name again. The food court was always my favorite place in the mall. It was where people gathered, where the smell of fried chicken, pizza, and sugary desserts blended into a comforting aroma. I worked at a small smoothie kiosk tucked in the corner, blending fruit and yogurt for tired shoppers. It was an easy job, low stress, decent tips, and I got to watch the world go by. That night started like any other. Families were finishing their meals, teenagers laughed loudly over trays of fries, and the janitors were already sweeping up stray crumbs. I was cleaning the blender when I noticed something odd. A man sitting alone at one of the tables near the edge of the court. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his hair slicked back like he'd stepped out of another era. He wasn't eating or drinking, just sitting there, staring at nothing. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone, but as the minutes ticked by, he didn't move. His stillness unnerved me. When my coworker Lisa came over to grab some napkins, I pointed him out. Weird, right? I said. She glanced over but frowned. "What guy?" she asked. My stomach dropped as I turned back to look at him. But now the table was empty. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. The man had been there. I was sure of it. His pale face and piercing stare were burned into my memory. "He was just there," I insisted to Lisa, but she shrugged and went back to restocking cups. Trying to shake off the unease, I returned to cleaning up for closing time. The food court emptied out quickly after that, leaving only a few stragglers finishing their meals under the harsh fluorescent lights. As I wiped down the counter, I couldn't help but glance back toward the table where the man had been sitting. It was still empty, but now there was something on it, a single plate with a piece of raw meat sitting in the center. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to the table cautiously. The plate looked old, chipped porcelain with faded blue patterns around the edges, and the meat on it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't beef or chicken or anything recognizable. It was dark and glistening with an oily sheen that made my stomach churn. I reached out to touch it but stopped myself just in time when a foul odor hit me, a mix of rot and iron so strong it made my eyes water. Gagging, I backed away quickly and turned to call for Lisa. But when I looked back at the kiosk, she wasn't there. "Lisa," I called out nervously, scanning the empty food court for any sign of her. The janitors were gone too, their cleaning carts abandoned near the trash bins as if they'd left in a hurry. The entire space felt wrong now. Too quiet, too still. Even the hum of refrigerators and soda machines seemed muted somehow. I pulled out my phone to text her but froze when I saw an unread message from an unknown number. *, don't leave. *, my hands shook as I stared at those two words on the screen. Before I could process what was happening, all the lights in the food court flickered violently before plunging me into darkness. The silence was broken by a sound that made my blood run cold, a low growl echoing through the empty space around me. It wasn't human. It sounded like some kind of animal, or something pretending to be one. My flashlight app barely illuminated a few feet ahead as I stumbled back toward the kiosk, desperate for some sense of safety. Then I saw them, figures emerging from behind counters and tables all around me. They weren't people. Not anymore. Their bodies were bloated and twisted, their skin stretched tight over misshapen bones that jutted out at odd angles. Each one held a plate piled high with raw meat similar to what had been on that table earlier. They moved slowly at first, dragging their feet across the tiled floor as they gathered around one large table in the center of the food court, the same table where I'd seen the man earlier that night. At the center of the grotesque gathering, the man in the suit stood atop the table, his polished shoes crushing the plates of raw meat beneath him. His grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glinted under the flickering food court lights. His hollow eyes glowed faintly, casting a sickly green hue over the twisted figures surrounding him. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and resonant, reverberating through the empty space like a bell tolling in a crypt. "Tonight's feast is special. We have a guest of honor." The creatures around him, bloated, misshapen things that had once resembled people, turned their heads toward me in unison. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their milky eyes gleaming with hunger. My legs felt rooted to the spot as I stared back at them, unable to move or even breathe. "You've been chosen," the man continued, stepping down from the table with an eerie grace. He walked toward me slowly, his shoes clicking against the tiles with each deliberate step. "Do you know why?" I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. His grin widened further, impossibly so, as he leaned in close enough for me to smell the metallic tang of blood on his breath. "Because you're still alive," he whispered. The creatures let out a collective growl, their bloated forms shifting as they began to rise from their seats. The creatures advanced toward me, their twisted limbs dragging across the floor as they closed in from all sides. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The man in the suit stepped back into the shadows, his glowing eyes watching intently as if savoring my terror. "You can join us," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the growls like a knife. "Or you can be served." The creatures lunged at me all at once, their claw-like hands reaching for my arms and legs. A scream tore from my throat as I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding their grasping fingers. My foot caught on an overturned chair, and I fell hard onto the tiled floor. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs, but adrenaline surged through me as I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward the smoothie kiosk. I ducked behind the counter of the kiosk, grabbing anything I could find to defend myself: a blender jar, a metal scoop, even a bottle of cleaning spray. The creatures reached over the counter with their bloated arms, knocking over cups and utensils as they clawed at me relentlessly. I swung the blender jar wildly, smashing it against one of their hands with a sickening crunch that sent shards of glass flying everywhere. The creature recoiled with an otherworldly shriek that made my ears ring, but it didn't stop the others from pressing forward. One of them managed to grab my wrist with its cold, slimy hand, pulling me closer to its gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. Desperation gave me strength as I yanked free from its grip and sprayed cleaning solution directly into its face. The creature howled in pain, its skin bubbling and hissing where the liquid touched it. Seizing my chance, I vaulted over the counter and sprinted toward one of the emergency exits at the far end of the food court. The man in the suit appeared in front of me suddenly, blocking my path with an impossibly wide grin plastered across his face. "Leaving so soon?" he asked mockingly as he raised one hand and snapped his fingers. The exit doors disappeared before my eyes, replaced by solid walls covered in pulsating black veins that seemed alive. My heart sank as I realized there was no way out, not through conventional means anyway. As I backed away from the wall in despair, I noticed something strange near one of the trash bins, a faint glow emanating from beneath it. Without thinking twice, I shoved it aside to reveal a small trapdoor hidden beneath layers of grime and discarded wrappers. The trapdoor led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness below. The growls and footsteps of the creatures grew louder behind me as I climbed down into what felt like another world entirely. A cavernous space filled with ancient stone pillars and flickering torches that cast long shadows across walls etched with strange symbols. At the center of this underground chamber stood an altar surrounded by more of those grotesque creatures, only these were larger and more monstrous than anything I'd seen above ground. The man in the suit appeared again beside me as if he'd been there all along. "This is where it ends," he said softly before gesturing toward the altar where something unspeakable awaited, something that would change me forever if I dared approach it.